This is Andrew Hall. Believe it or not, I first met him when he was working at Ohio History Connection. He was leading a booze tour around the village. But we were talking about fairy tales, and I said that I really would like to have somebody come and talk about why there are fairy tales. And he said, I could do that. I could do that. Now he is the executive director of the Ross County Historical Society. So he's made quite a trip to get here to talk to you about this subject, which I thought was very exciting. So this is Andrew Hall.
Thank you, Jane. All right. Let me start off. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, excellent. So thank you all for having me here today. I'm really happy to be here. Fairy tales and folktale history are some of my favorite topics. So I'm just really excited to be here to talk about this today. As Jane mentioned, I was running a little late because I had to come all the way up from Chillicothe from a series of committee meetings. So I appreciate your patience, and we'll get through some of these early slides quickly so we can get to some of the meaty stuff a little quicker. So we're going to be talking about a variety of things this afternoon. So really over the course of the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to be talking about fairy tales writ large. So we're going to talk about the general connections between fairy tales, history, and culture. We're going to talk a little bit about how those different stories interplay around the world. And then I'm going to draw out some specific examples for you. So we're going to talk about 3 stories that most of you will find pretty familiar. We're going to talk about one particular fairy tale that's a little obscure, but is a really great example. And then I have one that's much more recent that shows that we are still using a lot of these same fairy tale techniques even into the modern day. Just a quick thing I want to point out here. Up on the screen, the images that I have are of 3 particular fairy tale chroniclers that have been very well known in Western culture. So in the top right, we have one version of Grimm's fairy tales. So the brothers Grimm are writing and collecting stories primarily in Germany. To the left of that, we have a copy of Hans Christian Andersen. So he's also another author and collector of stories. And then down on the lowest end, these are all books. They're known as the Rainbow series by Andrew Lang. He's a little bit more obscure these days than the previous 2. Andrew Lang was a 19th century folklorist and chronicler. He made it his life's work to gather stories around the world and compile them for people to be able to read, specifically for children to be able to read. So it started off with he had the red fairy book, and then it turned into the blue and the green, and eventually he had a whole spectrum. And even after Andrew Lang passed away, his wife continued his work and continued that chronicling work. So we now today have a lot of stories from around the world that we wouldn't have had otherwise. Now, thinking about fairy tales around the world, I want to start off with just this image that I have up here behind me. Without any text, without any story, narrative, or any kind going along with this image, I guarantee every single person in this room has a story that they can associate with it. It's, to us, a very familiar story of Little Red Riding Hood. However, you could easily show this image to cultures all around the world and elicit a similar, but somewhat different, but similar story. And there have been, as of 2020, there have been 58 different unique recorded versions of Little Red Riding Hood found all throughout the world. And what this does is it touches on something that folklorists in particular research, which is a form of study that they call morphography. So essentially what folklorists in the 19th and early 20th centuries did is they started breaking down fairy tales and folk tales into their base component parts. So the specific rising actions and falling actions, specific motivations and character details that they were able to use to start cataloging and categorizing fairy tales from around the world. And that's when they start seeing that there are all these different stories from, you can say Italy, you have from China, places in South America. They're all telling the same story, even though they're not using any of the same names, any of the same details. It's that narrative structure that's the same. And that's really what I'm getting to the core of with this talk today. It's that fairy tales oftentimes are a creative way for us as people to be able to convey messages to one another. Oftentimes, fairy tales carry very heavily coded messaging. They're usually intended for very specific audiences, at least when they're originally created. And usually those audiences do broaden out over time. So I always think it's interesting. We often think fairy tales are for kids, right? But just as often, especially if you go back to the 19th, 18th, 17th centuries, fairy tales usually had a dual component. Oftentimes there was a message in there written for the kids, but then there's also a message written there for the parents, because these authors recognize the kids aren't usually reading these stories in a vacuum. They're usually being read to. So as the kids are receiving a message from being read to, the adults are learning about the message that's for them as they are reading the story to the kids. So what's just fascinating is the more you look into the interconnection between fairy tales and culture, the more you realize fairy tales are just a really great allegory and a way for us to share common problems or common experiences in a way that is creative and entertaining. And we're going to start off with something familiar, and then we'll dig a little deeper, a little more obscure as we go. So this first story that I want to bring up is one that I'm sure I don't actually have to tell to anybody in this room. This first picture on the top left, we are looking at the story of Rapunzel. Very, very popular story that comes from a number of different sources. We can see traces of Rapunzel's story going all the way back into antiquity. So while the most popular and common versions of Rapunzel's story are published in Germany in the early 19th century, we see aspects of her story that trail back to a number of different individuals and characters. The first one I have up here is the top right corner. This is Saint Barbara of Nicomedia. When she was a young girl, her father was of a mind that she was such a beautiful child that she would be a danger to herself and others. So she had to be locked away, much like Rapunzel, locked in a tower. So she's kept in this essentially kept in a fortress for almost her entire adolescent life. As a young woman, she has numerous suitors who approach the tower, and they are all shooed away by her father until, according to the story, an old, ugly, wealthy count approaches the castle, asks for his daughter's hand in marriage, and he, of course, says yes. Now, Barbara and her family come from pagan roots. During her time in the tower, according to this narrative, Barbara converted to Christianity and prayed to God for freedom from her situation. So one of the main miracles associated with her is that after making her heartfelt prayer, the roof of the fortress burst open and she was able to make her escape. Now, we're talking about fairy tales and their origins, so you can't imagine that that's where the story ends, right? Because fairy tales very rarely get to have a happy ending when we're talking about the real ones. Barbara of Nicomedia, unfortunately, is hunted down after she escapes the fortress and is killed by her father's retainers. However, shortly after her death, on a seemingly clear-skied day, her father is struck dead by a bolt of lightning. As such, by the time Barbara is eventually canonized into the Catholic Church, she becomes known as the patron saint of towers, fortresses. Seems kind of rude, doesn't it? Sailors. Here's where I think it gets really fun and interesting. Artillerists, explosives, and lightning and sudden death. She's got quite the catalog of things behind her. But this is a very popular story in the early Christian church. Not surprising that roots of it get tied up into fairy tales over time. Another earlier example that feeds into the Rapunzel story is the story of Princess Danae, which is referenced in a 19th century painting here in the bottom right corner. This is an ancient Greek myth in which a young woman named Danae and her father visit an oracle. While at Delphi, the oracle tells her father that Danae will give birth to a son who one day will return to kill her father. So the father, whose name is Acrisius, of course, in his own sense of self-preservation, decides to do what? Lock up his daughter. He figures if Danae can never be married, she can never have a child, then she can never have a grandson who will come and murder him. Anybody here who knows a little bit of their mythology will know, of course, that prophecies always have a funny way of working themselves out. So this is actually the story of Perseus. So Perseus ends up being born anyway through divine intervention. In this case, the divine intervention takes the form not of the roof being broken open and the person being freed, but in Zeus coming into the tower and helping her conceive a child. It's the best way to put it. Over time, eventually, she's able to give birth to this child and get him out of the tower before her father discovers him. Eventually, Perseus does come back and complete the prophecy. Yet another similar story in a completely different geographic region. We're going to jump all the way over to Ireland, where we're looking at early Irish and Gaelic folklore, when you have the roots of what will eventually become popular fairy and folk tradition in Ireland. They actually have a hierarchy of titans that are part of their pantheon. And there's a very similar story in which a titaness named Ethniu, the daughter of the grand titan Balor, is thought to be so devastatingly beautiful that she could ruin nations and continents with her beauty. So she is, of course, again, locked in a tower after Balor also learns that she will give birth to a son who will defeat him. And much like what happens with Danae, Ethniu is visited by a hero. She is left with a child. The child grows up and defeats her father. So again, this is not only showing we have three very distinct roots that tie into Rapunzel, we're also seeing a very interesting, repeated, very human story, this fear of the next generation, this fear of these older parents being replaced down the line. And almost in every single case, it has to do with power. It's this transition of power. It's kings worrying about losing their titles, gods losing their power. So again, fairy tales are a way in which we can talk about these really difficult subjects in a more simplistic way. A couple more somewhat familiar examples here. Starting on the left side, we're going to talk a little bit about Hans Christian Andersen, who's best known, arguably, for writing three works in particular. They'd be The Little Mermaid, The Nightingale, and The Snow Queen. The stories in particular that we're going to discuss right now are The Nightingale and The Snow Queen. Because as you start looking into the author's life, you start looking into the inspiration from where he drafted these fairy tales, you start realizing that he's putting a lot of his own personal experiences into his writing. In particular, Hans Christian Andersen is well known to have formed a relationship with world-renowned Swedish opera singer Jenny Lind. So Jenny Lind was always considered to be a somewhat homely looking woman, but she was always elevated by her singing talents. She was very flattered by Andersen when he first approached her in friendship. He admired her music. He wanted to get to know her more. And eventually, he actually even writes a story inspired by Jenny Lind, whose nickname amongst the musical community was Sweden's Nightingale. So Jenny Lind becomes this beautiful kind of symbol of perfection for Hans Christian Andersen. The two of them have a burgeoning friendship that goes for several years. They're seen repeatedly together in social circles and visiting different events until one year when Hans Christian Andersen inevitably, well, obviously decided that he could no longer keep his true feelings hidden. So he writes essentially a romantic letter to Jenny and sends it off to her in the hopes that they can grow their friendship into something more. Jenny Lind receives the letter and very politely declines. She replies in her letter that while she does care very deeply for Hans Christian Andersen, she sees the relationship in much more of a platonic sense, not in the romantic sense that he has been developing feelings for over the course of years. So what that leads to is immediately all known correspondence between Jenny Lind and Hans Christian Andersen cease. So this multi-year friendship after one letter exchange is gone. And within a year, he writes a story called The Snow Queen, which, for those of you who have not read it, centers around an antagonist, an evil queen, who can only sustain her own life by warming her own cold heart by stealing the innocent, pure hearts of young boys. So, while Andersen never explicitly came out and said that he wrote The Snow Queen inspired by his relationship with Jenny Lind, through this type of investigation, it's pretty clear that he was definitely writing a fair amount of his own personal experiences into his stories. Yet again, another way in which fairy tales convey these just really troublesome emotions that we have sometimes. Here on the right side, we have what I think is the most interesting and likely the closest true story to Beauty and the Beast. So the image that you're seeing right here is an illustration of a man named Petrus Gonsalves, who was sent to the court of King Henry II at the age of 10 years old after he was taken from his home in Spain. He was taken in particular because he had a disease known as hypertrichosis universalis, which is essentially a medical version of, or one of the various medical versions of werewolfism or lycanthropy. It causes you to grow an excessive amount of hair all over your body. So if you think back to like the late 19th, early 20th century, think back to like P.T. Barnum, there's the whole idea of the dog-faced boy. That's what this is. This is a real medical condition. So Petrus is taken in a raid and is sold as a court jester to the court of Henry II of France. So he lives out the next decade of his life as a jester, as just a member of the court. And over the course of those 10 years, different courtiers, different vassals, and even Henry himself start taking an interest in Petrus because they realize at first they literally treat him like a pet. They give him a pen, they feed him like an animal, they treat him like an animal, but they realize quickly that he is intelligent, that he has the capacity to learn multiple languages. And they also, again, this goes into the idea of him being a pet. They thought it was funny to dress him up in fancy clothes. But as they started doing this, they accidentally, in their own way, started uncovering his humanity. By the time Petrus reaches the age of about 20, he's actually granted his freedom and is granted a small dukedom. So he's given property. And after the death of Henry II, his wife, Catherine de' Medici, actually goes out of her way to look and find Petrus a wife. Goes through a series of young women trying to find someone who will be the right fit for someone who's not conceived as being conventionally attractive. Eventually, Petrus and his wife, also conveniently named Catherine, end up having 7 children, 5 of whom are born with the same condition that he was born with. So we know, based on folklorist research, the earliest version of Beauty and the Beast comes out of southern France, right around the early 1600s, which is roughly 100 years after Petrus Gonzalez's story plays out. So it's a pretty clear indication, or at least a pretty clear inspiration for the story of Beauty and the Beast. And I really love this idea, especially of the burgeoning humanity in someone who's not seen as human. That's something that we do see in a lot of different fairy tales. This is one that I think I'm glad to see has remained popular, and I think is another great example why it's good to know your history, because it makes the story even more impactful than the one that we're used to. Okay, so this next story is a little bit more obscure. Some of you might know it. How many people here recognize the story, The Town Musicians of Bremen? Oh, about half of us, actually. That's great. So I'll give a really quick run through for those of you who are not familiar with the story. So we start here on the far left with this weird stack of animals. The story goes that there is a farm where there's an old donkey, a dog, a cat, and a rooster who all have had specific jobs. The donkey's job is to pull the cart and the plow. The dog's job is to watch all of the sheep. The cat's job is to catch all the mice. And the rooster's job, of course, is to caw in the morning. All 4 of these animals are quite long in the tooth by the time we are introduced to them at the story. So the rooster is starting to lose his voice. The cat's joints are a little stiff. He has a hard time chasing mice anymore. The dog is getting old. It's having a hard time keeping up with the sheep. And the donkey is also old and tired, having a hard time carrying all those heavy burdens. When you think about what a practical 19th century working farm needs to do in order to stay functional, what do you do with animals that are no longer serving their purpose? Usually you butcher them. So all 4 of these animals, all of whom they're sentient, they speak, they are all well aware of the circumstances facing them. So they get together and they decide either they can stay at the farm and eventually be killed by their owner, or they can risk going off on their own and trying to find a way to live their own lives. So that's what they do. So the image on the far left is a statue that you can find in Bremen today. There's actually several of them throughout the city, dedicated to the story. The people there take this story very much to heart. The representation there in the statue is, as the animals are traveling, they start recognizing that humans aren't going to react well to a bunch of talking animals. So they have to come up with some kind of conceit in order to make it so they can interact with people. So they realize if they stack themselves one on top of the other and drape an old cloak over themselves, they just look like a hunched over person. So as they're putting together this conceit, they're also starting to talk about what are all the different talents we have. And they very quickly realize they all have different talents that can lend themselves to playing music. So as they eventually reach the town of Bremen, which is their initial destination, they decide to stack up, head into town, and they prop themselves up on a street corner and they start playing music for people. So they collect money. They use that money to buy themselves food and lodging, and they do this for a little while. Until inevitably someone gets a little too close, bumps into the musician, and the Tower of Animals falls over. People see it, they scream, animals have to scatter and run away. So the latter half of the story focuses on these animals trying to find a home for themselves after they've been chased out of Bremen, after they've had to leave their farm. And it sees them eventually finding an abandoned cottage in the middle of the woods. They set up in this cottage, they make a nice home for themselves, but eventually have to defend themselves against a pack of roving bandits who attempt to invade the home and take anything of value. Again, in a humorous display of events, the animals use all of their very unique talents to chase off the burglars and thus secure themselves a safe and permanent home. And that's where the story ends. So it's odd to think that a story like this might have really serious, deep roots, but it comes directly inspired out of the ashes of the Napoleonic War. So I have this map up here so that way you can have a better idea of how to just visualize the overall scope of what became known as the First French Empire. So everything outlined in red that you see up here are territories that were conquered by Napoleon's empire during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, recognizing that that doesn't necessarily mean that Napoleon occupied all of this territory, but it does mean that this entire region was under about 20 years of intense, bitter warfare. And just as quickly as the war seemed to have started, it's gone. And in the wake of the war, there's a lot of problems left behind. In particular, people have to rebuild their lives and rebuild their communities. If you've ever read anything about what a large army does on the march, you know that it's like a swarm of locusts. It eats up and takes any supplies, food, goods it can find along the way. So as civilians are coming home, they're trying to literally piece their lives back together. We can take inspiration from the town musicians of Bremen who have to work together in order to survive. They are pooling their unique resources and finding a way to make it work. It's also a story that tells us that those in our world who aren't as capable as they may have used to be, whether they're too old now or they're injured, they are disabled in some way, much like all four of our animals are in the story. This story shows that there's still a place for you in the community. It's about coming together and actually working as a group and as a unit. Interestingly enough, though, the last bit of the story is what has the closest tie to the Napoleonic War, and that's the bit about the bandits, the marauders coming in for the cabin. And this is going back to what I was saying earlier about sometimes these stories also have messages for adults. Because in 1819, you put yourself somewhere in central Germany, you are very, very likely to run into roving groups of now forcibly retired soldiers, men who fought in the Napoleonic Wars. They were conscripted, whether, regardless of which side they fought for, they were trained up. They had a job, now they don't. And now they are roaming around Central and Western Europe, basically just committing banditry. So this story is in itself also a cautionary tale about not wandering too deeply into the woods, not wandering too deeply away from your community, because there are dangerous people around. All right. So I have one last deep dive example here that I want to talk about. And that's a more modern fairy tale. And that would be Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which is published right around the turn of the century. Out of curiosity, who here has ever read the original Frank Baum, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz? It's a good number of us. And yeah, that is, it can be a little strange. And from my remembrance, they get stranger the deeper you go if you start reading the sequels. But for those who may not have read the original book, or who, it's been a long while, it's really interesting when we put the book in conversation with the film and see the comparison and contrast, the points where comparison contrasts, because the book was written as a really, really specific message at a really specific time. So in 1896, the United States went through a major economic recession. It was one of the worst banking crises prior to the Great Depression. And at that time, there is a major debate happening in the United States over how the economy should be run. So up till that point, and as it stands now, the United States ran on a gold standard. There were an ever-growing group of individuals calling for silver to be added to the currency standard, because right around 1895, it was estimated that the continental United States sat on 50% of the world's silver deposits. So the idea was that if you add silver into the currency to back the US dollar, the United States is going to have an even firmer financial standpoint to be on. Now, this caused way more debate than I feel like anybody in the modern day would care to argue about something. We have big issues that we argue about today, but I'm just trying to imagine in our own current political discourse arguing about silver or gold when we have larger issues at play. But people thought this was an extremely important issue. They were very passionate about it, so much so that people wrote books about it. The Wizard of Oz is one such book. Frank Baum was a staunch supporter of bimetallism. He thought that the future of America was in America's heartland in the Midwest, both in the unmined silver deposits and in the ever growing and ever increasingly large agricultural sector coming out of the Midwest. So when he wrote this book, it was intended to be a political and economic commentary for the adults who are reading the story to their kids. So the hope is that the kids get something enjoyable out of it, and the adults get something to think about. So there are a few very important differences in the book version that really showcase this message. And you can see some of that in these bottom two photos that I have here. These are original images from the first illustrated version of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which I believe was published in 1908. And one of the first things that you'll notice that's a major difference between the Wizard of Oz that we're used to and the original book is that the slippers that are being worn in this version are silver and not ruby. And that's because silver in the original meaning of the book was supposed to represent the power that free silver would bring to the United States and the safety and security that it would offer in the long run. So that's why the idea of these silver slippers, the concept of bimetallism, is being fought over throughout the course of the narrative. While we're talking about this, let's just dig down into what all of those symbols even mean, because there are symbols in this book that you probably don't even recognize until you actually have it spelled out, and then it's just like, oh, I'm surprised I missed it. So we've already talked about the silver slippers. Now, think about what the characters walk on to make their way to Oz. They walk on a yellow brick road. And what is America supposed to be paved with? Gold, exactly. The yellow brick road is America's gold foundation. It is the thing that gives America something to base itself on, but it's the silver that's supposed to still take you home and keep you safe. Emerald is a very prominent color in the Wizard of Oz. The Emerald City is the destination. Emerald is a reflection of, in Frank Baum's view, of the American cash system. So just like how cash is a bit of an illusion in the way that our economy actually works, when you first walk into the Emerald City in the Wizard of Oz in the original book, every person entering the city has to put on a pair of emerald tinted glasses because the entire original Emerald City is a facade. It's all white. It's only, the whole thing is that it's all propped up to look like it's much more lavish than it actually is. And that's the illusion of a cash system sometimes. Just to round off our colors here while we're at it, the ruby red slippers, those get added in 1939. And that is actually an intentional attempt by Hollywood to both show off their fantastic new Technicolor technology, as well as deliver essentially a well-needed piece of morale boost in a very difficult time. So they tried to make the Wizard of Oz feature production as extravagant as they possibly could, especially as the United States is still coming out of the Depression, going into getting involved with World War II and everything like that. So now let's start thinking about what all of our characters mean, because each component of this book has a historical and a cultural tie-in. So starting off with Dorothy's companions, we have the Scarecrow. Scarecrow is a representation of the American Midwest, of the simple farmer that is the backbone of America. Now, I will say it feels like a little bit of an underhanded compliment on Frank Baum's part, because of course he is showing the Scarecrow is an essential companion along the road, but of course he's brainless. So it's a reflection of the poorly educated American farmer, right? And sometimes the messaging gets a little hazy. Next up, we have the Tin Man. He is a representation of American industry. And at his core, in spite of the fact that he is a staunch supporter of the troop, he is still heartless at his core, much like the heartless capitalist industrialists who are constantly being besieged at this time. You know, this is still when trust busting is happening. So you've got people like Carnegie, all those big name folks still being addressed. Next down on the list, we have the Cowardly Lion. So if you think about the lion and its accepted place in the wild, we oftentimes consider the lion to be the king of the jungle. The lion is a leader among animals. So a cowardly lion is a leader who has no ability to lead. The Cowardly Lion is a reflection of American politicians who are considered to be do-nothings. And as we continue to talk, you're going to recognize there are a lot of similarities. The Wizard of Oz has this really interesting habit of coming back into the public consciousness every time the United States is having a major economic issue. Think about, when this was published, it's right after a major economic collapse. The film comes out shortly after the Great Depression. Wicked and all of the most recent adaptations that have come out recently. It's just an interesting parallel. Let's see. So next on our list of characters, we have Dorothy herself. Dorothy is a representation of the average American voter. She is the hopeful populist voter who is choosing silver. She's choosing her companions. She's making, at least in Frank Baum's argument, she's making the right decisions to take her on the path home. We have a number of witches in the story. So there's the Wicked Witch of the East, who's only ever seen Sock First. She is, by being the Wicked Witch of the East, She is essentially the old world 19th century East Coast economic center of America, which has now been crushed by the agrarian Midwest, literally by a Kansas farmhouse. Look on the opposite side, you have the Wicked Witch of the West. In the story, she is constantly placing hazards and challenges in the face of our heroes. In that way, she is a representation of American westward expansion and the constant challenge of growing the American West and Midwest. We also have Glinda, the Good Witch, who makes a few appearances in the film and in the book. She is actually a representation of Columbia, the original American spirit of liberty and freedom. So if you look back to old 19th and late 18th century American artwork, illustrations, you'll often see an angelic figure holding a light or a lantern aloft ahead of her. That is Columbia, the same Columbia that the District of Columbia is named after. She is, like I said, that kind of initial, in a simple way, she's America's first mascot. Very much a prominent figure before Uncle Sam becomes popular. So we've gotten through all the witches now, just a few more characters left. We've got the Munchkins, who in the original book are not all just little people. They are people of all shape, size, color, and appearance, because they are meant to represent literally anybody who's been marginalized by the American system. Second to last, we have the Flying Monkeys. They are a representation of the American wage slave, of what happens when the American capitalist system gets too overblown and the worker starts to be oppressed. And the last I saved because it's my personal favorite. It's the Wizard of Oz himself. Much like Oz and the city, the wizard is an illusion, right? We first see him as a giant head, then we see that he's just a man behind the curtain. So he is a representation of the American president. Not any specific American president, but any American president, because he looks and sounds big and powerful, but in all actuality, he's just a normal guy. So those are just a few ways that we can see how this story generated out of seemingly completely unrelated topics that people found important enough to write about. So fairy tales throughout all of history have done these same types of things. The more you dig into it, the more similarities you start seeing between cultures who never had any contact with each other. And it just gives more credence to this recognition of, it doesn't matter where we're from. We are all people. We are all humans. We have similar experiences, and fairy tales are a great way for us to be able to share those experiences with one another. Anybody have any questions?
I have one. What does Toto represent?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, I'm not sure. In all of my research, Toto never came up, and that seems like a glaring hole. So I'll have to look into that. Any other questions? Oh, one in the back.
I just wanted to say I used fairy tales a lot when I was a librarian at elementary school, and they were just absolutely floored when they realized what all different cultures have the same story. There are over 497 Cinderella stories from around the world, and they go from very innocent to cannibalism. So it's really quite fascinating, and thank you very much for your insight today.
Absolutely, and thank you. It's one of the reasons why I study history in general and fairy tales in particular. They're the experiences that bring us together as people. I often like to tell people I'm not a historian more than I am a storyteller, because historians are expected to remember things like specific names and dates and battles and things like that. I'm just more interested in the stories that people had to tell. Oh, we got a question up here. Oh, she's bringing up the microphone for you.
You don't
Obviously,
wanna
neither do I.
that. I was wondering if you would tell them,
They gotta hear it on Zoom.
oh, that's true. Okay, sorry. How he came up with the name Oz.
Oh, yes.
That's
Actually,
a
that
great
is
story.
that is something
Yeah,
I do
yeah, yeah.
know. So
How
she,
did they come up with the name Oz?
yeah, where Oz comes from. Because of course, in a book so heavily laden with symbolism, it has to have a meaning, just like I'm sure Toto has to have a meaning. So if you think about the core of it, the bimetallism, gold is measured in carats. Silver has always been measured and weighed in ounces. So literally, it's the land of the ounce. It's the land of Oz.
Andrew,
There was
W-
more. There's more. The way he came up with that idea was he was telling this story because he would tell stories to the kids in the neighborhood. And he was telling a bunch of kids stories and they were asking where the story took place. And he didn't have one in his head. And so he was looking at two sets of dictionaries. So it was A to N, and then O to Z. And he said, "Oh, Oz."
See, that seems more like a realistic way that he came up with
Yeah,
it.
but why not both?
Well, exactly. He may
How
have
cool is
ascribed the
that?
meaning after the fact, but I see, and I love those types of little stories that just brings things together. It's
so
fun.
we have the answer to Toto.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I referenced Google AI. In the Wizard of Oz, Toto represents this power of small, seemingly insignificant individuals to expose deception and reveal the truth. He's a loyal companion to Dorothy, and through his actions, particularly when he exposes the wizard, he symbolizes the importance of courage and vigilance, even when facing seemingly powerful forces.
That makes a lot of
Toto
sense.
also represents the average person who can make a difference.
Excellent. Well, thank you for finding that. And I think we can all take a little inspiration from the Totos of the world in a troubled world today. It's always good to have somebody who's that squeaky wheel.
Last summer, I went to the Museum of Oz in Kansas,
Ooh.
and it's in this little town, and it is one of the most fascinating museums I have ever been to. I mean, we actually spent we were going to go in there for an hour because we like to collect little quirky museums. We were there for about 6 hours.
That's the right kind of museum to visit. Looks like we have a question in the back.
So the flying monkeys, same in Google, a representative of the Native Americans in the West in the late 80s, 1800s.
That's an interesting interpretation I hadn't read before, but that could also make sense. Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I love doing presentations like this, because I always come out learning a little something. You always get different approaches, different perspectives. And yeah. Well, I want to thank you all for having me here today. And I want to welcome you all to come and visit us down in Ross County if you ever get the chance. So Ross County Historical Society is the main historical society for Chillicothe and the entirety of Ross County. For those of you who aren't aware, Ross County was recently awarded World Heritage status for the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks that are in the region. So it's a really awesome historical place to visit if you have any interest in local history. Chillicothe was both Ohio's first and third capital and has really played a major part in the state since its inception. So if you ever find your way coming down south, if you want to go see Tecumseh, if you're going to go visit Adena Mansion and Gardens, make sure you stop on by over to the Ross County Historical Society. Thank you.